The wind carried dust across the main street of Dry Creek, a town no bigger than a handful of saloons, a blacksmith's forge, and a clapboard church standing against the endless plains. In the distance, thunder rumbled, rolling low like a warning from the sky itself. It was the kind of storm that came quick on the frontier, sudden and merciless. But the storm I carried inside me that night was far greater than anything nature could conjure. My name is Thomas Avery, and though most folks knew me as a cattle hand and a decent rider, they would one day remember me as the man who should have died under the earth, yet somehow drew breath again. Before I tell you how I came to claw at the wooden walls of my own coffin, I must ask one thing of you. If you wish to follow me through every twist of this tale, through dust, deceit, and the fight for justice, then stay with me. Subscribe, so you don't lose track of this journey where every word carries weight, and every silence hides a secret. Dry Creek looked harmless enough to any stranger passing through. The saloon piano clinked out a tune every evening, cowboys clattered their boots on the boardwalks, and cattle buyers argued prices over whiskey. But beneath the laughter and the card games, there was a shadow that settled deeper than dusk. Sheriff James Colton, a man who wore his badge polished bright, ruled this town not with law but with fear dressed up as authority. I first saw his true face the night I lingered too long outside his office. I had gone there to deliver a message for Jacob Whitfield, the rancher who employed me. But the door had been left ajar, the lantern burning low inside, and Colton's voice drifted through like a snake's hiss. "You think anyone's going to dig up the truth?" he muttered, speaking to one of his deputies. "That rancher never saw it coming, and Thomas Avery won't either if he sticks his nose where it doesn't belong." My stomach clenched. He spoke of a man who'd vanished months ago, a neighbor of the Whitfields, blamed for rustling cattle. Folks said he'd fled the county in shame. But what I heard that night was no tale of shame. It was confession. Clear as thunder splitting the night, Colton admitted he'd put a bullet in the man and buried him where no one would ever look. I should have turned away. A smart man would have kept his boots quiet, carried his secret like a stone in his chest. But something in me, call it stubbornness, call it a sense of justice too heavy for my own good, wouldn't let me walk. My heart hammered, my breath shallow, yet I leaned closer, every word carving itself into me. Colton's deputy shifted nervously. "Sheriff, what if somebody talks?" "Then they'll end up the same way," Colton replied coldly. That sentence settled into me like the cold barrel of a gun pressed to the back of my neck. I knew then that if he caught wind I'd been listening, my life would be worth less than the dust on my boots. When I finally stepped away from that door, the storm had broken overhead. Lightning forked across the plains, rain drummed on rooftops, and the town lights blurred through the downpour. My mind raced faster than my horse as I rode back toward the Whitfield ranch. But no matter how hard I tried to steady my thoughts, one truth pulsed louder than the storm itself. I had heard the sheriff confess to murder, and nothing in Dry Creek would ever be the same again. The weight of that knowledge was a coffin waiting to close. And though I didn't yet know it, Sheriff Colton already had his shovel in hand. The storm rolled on through the night, leaving the streets of Dry Creek washed in mud by morning. Wagons splashed through ruts, boots struck the softened boardwalks, and every building carried that smell of wet wood and smoke from stoves burning inside. Life in town seemed ordinary again, but I carried the weight of what I'd heard the night before. Sheriff James Colton's words wouldn't leave me. They coiled around my thoughts like barbed wire, catching me with every step. Colton moved about the town that morning, as if nothing hung on his conscience. His hat brim shadowed a face that looked carved from stone, moustache trimmed neat, boots polished like he was headed to church. Folks nodded to him with respect, some even with relief, as though his very presence kept the world from turning wild. But I had listened in the dark, and I knew. Every handshake, every tip of his hat looked different to me now. "Morning, Avery," he called as I passed with a bundle of supplies for the ranch. His voice was steady, friendly even, but there was something cold behind it, something that made the hair rise on my neck. "Morning, Sheriff," I answered, keeping my tone flat, my eyes down. He studied me longer than was comfortable, like a hawk circling a rabbit. I forced myself not to quicken my step, though every part of me wanted distance. When I finally turned the corner, I let out the breath I'd been holding. The townsfolk didn't see it. They saw the badge, the order he kept, the way trouble never lasted long in Dry Creek. They didn't question why men who crossed him seemed to vanish or why certain ranches lost land when disputes arose. To them he was law. To me he was a man hiding a grave with his own hands. I tried to shake the thought, but my path took me past the saloon where Mary Whitfield stood on the steps, waiting for her father. Mary had a way of carrying herself that made the dust and noise of Dry Creek seem smaller. Her hair was tied back simple, her dress plain, yet her eyes, sharp, steady, missed nothing. She smiled faintly when she saw me. "Thomas," she said, stepping down to meet me, "you look like you've ridden through the night." "Didn't sleep much," I admitted. My voice was lower than usual, burdened. She tilted her head, studying me. "Something's weighing on you." I wanted to tell her everything, but the danger of it pressed my tongue down. Instead, I asked, "Do you trust Sheriff Colton?" Her expression tightened, though she masked it quickly. "That depends on who's asking, and why." "I'm just asking," I said, though we both knew it was more. Mary lowered her voice. "My father's had his doubts about Colton for years. Too many disputes settled in his favor, too many whispers that never see daylight. You'd do well to tread careful, Thomas. A man can drown quicker in suspicion than in water." Her words lingered with me as Jacob Whitfield emerged from the saloon, nodding his thanks to the barkeep who'd handed him ledgers. Jacob was a man whose presence filled space without raising his voice. When he saw me, he gave a brief nod, then gestured for Mary to follow him toward their wagon. She glanced back once, her eyes carrying both warning and understanding. As I turned to head home, I caught sight of Deputy Hank Rawley, leaning against a post outside the sheriff's office. He was broad-shouldered, with a scar running along his jaw and a grin that never reached his eyes. He spat tobacco into the mud, then gave me a slow, knowing smile. "You keepin' busy, Avery?" he called. "Plenty to do on the ranch," I answered. "Good. Best place for a man's work is out there, not in town where lawmen have business." The words were casual, but the weight behind them wasn't lost on me. Colton's shadow stretched long across Dry Creek, and I had stepped into it the moment I heard his confession. Every look, every word carried warning now. The sheriff's eyes were on me, and I knew sooner or later he'd test just how much I had heard. The days after that storm carried a strange tension, like the air before lightning strikes. Dry Creek bustled as usual. Wagons rattled down the main street. Cowhands argued over cards, and women hurried between the mercantile and the church. But for me, every sound carried an edge. Every glance lingered too long. Sheriff Colton's shadow wasn't something I could shake. His eyes found me wherever I went, though his smile never faltered, and that made it worse. One afternoon I was repairing a fence line on the Whitfield ranch when a rider appeared, mud caked to his boots and dust to his coat. He was a boy I'd seen working errands for Colton, thin and nervous, glancing around as though the prairie itself might be listening. "You Avery?" he asked, stopping short of the fence. "That's right," I said, leaning on the post. He shifted in the saddle. "Sheriff said he needs a word with you. Urgent matter just outside town, said it wasn't fit for other ears." My gut tightened, but I kept my face steady. "What's it about?" The boy shrugged. "Didn't say. Just told me to fetch you. Tonight, by Miller's Creek." Miller's Creek lay half a mile from town, quiet, lined with cottonwoods. A place where cattlemen watered their herds and outlaws sometimes made trades under cover of dark. Too quiet, too hidden. "I'll be there," I said flatly. As the boy rode off, I felt Jacob Whitfield's eyes on me from across the pasture. He approached slow, his hand steady on the reins. "What was that about?" he asked. "Colton wants a word. At Miller's Creek. Tonight." Jacob's jaw tightened. "A word? Or a grave?" I forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "Maybe both." He studied me a long moment, then nodded. "You watch yourself. Colton doesn't invite men to quiet places unless he plans to silence them." That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, I saddled my horse and rode toward the creek. The cottonwoods swayed against the fading light, their leaves whispering like uneasy voices. Every hoofbeat sounded louder than it should. I kept my hand close to the Colt at my hip, though some part of me knew steel wouldn't be enough against Colton's kind of power. When I reached the bend of the creek, he was already there. Sheriff James Colton sat tall in his saddle, hat low, the silver badge on his chest catching the last glint of dusk. Two of his deputies flanked him, Hank Rawley with that cruel grin, and another man whose hand never strayed far from his revolver. "Avery," Colton drawled, his voice smooth as polished oak. "I appreciate you coming out here without question." I kept my horse steady. "Didn't sound like a request." Colton chuckled, slow and heavy. "You've got spirit, that's good. But spirit can be dangerous when it runs wild. You've been poking around where you don't belong, asking questions, listening at doors. Now, a man in my position can't afford to have loose tongues spreading wild stories, you understand." My pulse thudded in my ears, but I held his gaze. "What I understand is that law's supposed to protect folks, not bury them." The deputies shifted in their saddles. Hank spat into the dirt. "You got a sharp tongue, Avery. Best cut it before somebody else does." Colton leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'll give you one chance. Forget what you think you heard. Keep your head down, work your cattle, and let me handle Dry Creek. Or," he paused, letting the silence bite harder than his words, "or you'll find the ground awful close and awful permanent." I felt the noose tightening, though no rope hung from the trees. His warning wasn't just words. It was a promise. And in that promise I saw my fate written clear. Sooner or later the sheriff meant to put me in the earth. The night settled cold around us, the creek whispering against the rocks. I turned my horse slowly, forcing my voice steady. "I reckon a man's got to choose whether to live with fear or die with truth." Colton's smile faded, and for the first time I saw the edge of his patience crack. That was when I knew I hadn't walked into a meeting. I had stepped straight into a trap, and it was already closing around me. The cottonwood stood silent as stone when Colton finally gave the signal. I had half expected it, maybe even braced myself for it, but no man can truly prepare for the feel of a barrel striking the back of his skull. The world shattered into sparks, then darkness. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the weight. Not just heavy, but crushing, pressing down on my chest and face. My arms were pinned, my legs cramped, my head throbbing with every heartbeat. It was pitch black. The air was thick, stale, and filled with the raw scent of pine boards. I tried to move, and the wood pressed back. Realization cut deeper than the blow had. I was in a coffin. Panic clawed at me, wilder than any storm. My breaths came fast, stealing what little air there was. I shoved against the lid, but dirt cascaded down, sifting through cracks, choking my throat. My fists pounded until my knuckles split, the thud muffled, swallowed by the earth above. "No, no, not like this," I rasped, my voice strangled by fear. Images rushed through me, Dry Creek at dusk, Mary's steady eyes, Jacob's quiet warnings. The Whitfield ranch bathed in the glow of lantern light, all of it slipping away, as though Colton had sealed not just my body, but every memory beneath the ground. I forced myself to still. Panic would kill me quicker than the dirt. I slowed my breathing, though each inhale tasted of splinters and damp earth. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out every thought but one: survive. I pushed again, weaker this time, my palms scraping rough boards. Splinters dug into my skin. My body screamed for air, my lungs burning. The coffin seemed to shrink with each second, pressing tighter, smothering what little strength I had left. "God help me," I whispered, my voice cracking. It was not a prayer of ritual, but of raw desperation, the kind a man breathes when all other choices are gone. A sound answered. At first faint, lost in the pounding of my heart, then clearer, a dull thud, rhythmic, above me. Dirt shifting. My eyes widened in the dark. I wasn't alone in this grave. I beat against the coffin again, this time not from panic, but from hope. My fists struck the wood in rhythm with the thuds above, a signal, a plea. More dirt shifted, heavier now, then the sharp crack of something hitting the coffin lid. My breath caught as light, thin, golden, glorious, pierced through a splintered crack. I coughed as fresh air rushed in, filling my burning lungs. Hands, rough, strong, tore at the boards, pulling them apart piece by piece until at last the coffin gave way. I clawed upward, gasping, the night sky spinning above me like salvation. The cool air hit my face, damp with sweat and dirt. I coughed again, dragging myself onto the ground, trembling as though every bone had turned to water. My chest heaved, each breath sharp as a knife. I looked up through blurred vision, and there stood the figure who had pulled me back from death. Lantern light flickered against a weathered face lined by years of sun and toil, eyes steady and unshaken. Jacob Whitfield. "Easy now," he said, his voice calm, grounding me as surely as his hands. "You're not gone yet." I wanted to speak, but words tangled in my throat, lost between gratitude and shock. My lips formed his name, raw and broken. "Jacob." He nodded, kneeling beside me. "Save your strength. You've stared the grave in the eye tonight, son. Don't waste breath on what you already know." I lay back against the earth, the taste of soil still bitter on my tongue, the terror of the coffin clinging to me like a second skin. But even through the haze, one truth cut clear. Colton had meant to bury me alive, and somehow I had risen again. The sheriff thought he'd silenced me. He hadn't counted on Jacob Whitfield. The night was quiet except for the crackle of Jacob Whitfield's lantern and the rasp of my own breath. I sat on the cold ground, dirt clinging to my skin, the taste of earth still lodged in my throat. My hands shook so badly I could barely wipe the sweat from my brow. Jacob crouched beside me, steady as an oak, his eyes holding a calm strength that kept me from collapsing altogether. "You should be dead," he said matter-of-factly, though not unkindly. "Colton doesn't leave loose ends." I thought I was gone," I whispered. My voice felt like it belonged to someone else, ragged and hollow. "You came close," Jacob replied. "Too close." He handed me a flask. The whiskey burned going down, but it steadied my shaking hands, grounding me back in the world of the living. I looked at him, still struggling to piece together how he had been there, how he had known. "Why?" I croaked. "Why were you digging when the rest of the world thought me buried?" He sat back on his heels, lantern light throwing deep shadows across his weathered face. "Because I've been watching Colton a long time, too long. And when that boy rode past the ranch with fear in his eyes, saying he'd carried a message from the sheriff, I knew you were walking into something you wouldn't walk out of. I followed your trail. Guess I was right." I let the words sink in, the reality of how close I had been to ending beneath 6 feet of dirt. My chest tightened, not from lack of air this time, but from the weight of gratitude and dread colliding. "You saved me," I said hoarsely. Jacob's eyes softened just enough to reveal a flicker of warmth. "No, son. I gave you another chance. What you do with it, that's on you." The lantern flame hissed in the night breeze, and I thought about Colton's cold voice, promising to put me in the ground. He had already buried me once. He'd try again. "I can't let him get away with this," I said, my voice hardening. "He's murdered, cheated, stolen from this town, and folks look at him like he's salvation. I heard him confess, Jacob. I can't carry that and do nothing." Jacob studied me, silent for a long while. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate. "You've got a good heart, Thomas. Stronger than most men. But listen to me. This fight won't be won with fists or fast draws. Colton's not just a man, he's a system. He's got deputies loyal to him, townsfolk afraid of him, and enough power to turn the law itself into a weapon. You rush in, you'll end up right back where I pulled you from." "So what do I do?" I asked, frustration rising. "Sit quiet? Pretend I didn't hear his confession?" Jacob shook his head. "No. You fight smart, patient, like ranch work. There's no breaking a wild steer in a day. You work at it, steady and sure, until it bends. Same with Colton. You gather proof, gather allies, and when the time comes, you strike with more than a pistol. You strike with truth strong enough to turn a town against him." His words settled into me, heavy but solid. He was right. A lone man couldn't stand against Colton's machine. But with evidence, with people willing to believe, maybe, just maybe, the sheriff's badge would lose its shine. I wiped dirt from my face and tried to steady my trembling limbs. The coffin still clung to me, the suffocating dark, the scrape of wood against my skin. That grave wasn't just behind me. It was inside me now, a reminder of what waited if I failed. "I'll do it," I said quietly, but with steel in my voice. "I'll find a way to bring him down." Jacob nodded once, then rose, offering me his hand. "Then stand up, Thomas. You've already been buried." "What's left to fear?" I grasped his hand, pulling myself upright. My body was weak, but my resolve burned fiercer than ever. Sheriff Colton thought he had ended me. Instead, he had forged something stronger. The Whitfield Ranch rose out of the plains like a small kingdom of its own. Wide stretches of grazing land rolled toward the horizon, dotted with longhorn cattle moving slow under the watch of ranch hands. The smell of hay and leather hung thick in the air, mingled with the smoke of the cook fire drifting from the bunkhouse. After the coffin, after the taste of earth choking my lungs, stepping onto that ranch felt like stepping back into life itself. Mary met us at the porch, her lantern casting a warm glow. When she saw me slumped in the saddle, dirt-streaked and pale, her hand flew to her mouth. "Thomas, what happened?" Her voice trembled with worry, though she steadied it quickly, the way someone raised on the frontier learns to mask fear. "Sheriff Colton happened," Jacob said, swinging down from his horse. His tone carried no softness, only the hard truth. Mary's eyes widened, but she asked no more, as though she already knew Colton was behind whatever had broken me. She reached up and touched my arm lightly. "Come inside. You need rest before anything else." They guided me into the house, the warmth of the fire wrapping around me, the scent of bread and stew clinging to the air. I sank onto a chair, my legs barely holding me. Mary brought water first, then clean cloths to wipe the dirt and blood from my hands. Her touch was careful, her expression both tender and resolute. "You're lucky to be breathing," she murmured, rinsing the cloth in a basin. "If my father hadn't found you—" I caught her gaze, and for a moment words failed me. Gratitude, shame, and something deeper all tangled in my chest. Finally I managed, "I don't reckon luck had much to do with it, more like providence and your father's suspicion." Jacob stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed, watching us both. "Suspicion keeps men alive out here," he said, "and Colton's given me reason enough to keep mine sharp." The following days passed in slow rhythm. My body ached with every movement, muscles stiff from the ordeal of being buried alive, but the Whitfields gave me space to mend. Mary brought meals, strong coffee in the mornings, broth at midday, bread and beans by evening. She spoke little at first, letting silence fill the air, but her presence alone steadied me. Outside, the ranch pulsed with life. Cattle bawled in the distance, the clang of a branding iron rang from the pens, and the men's shouts carried across the fields as they drove the herds. I listened from the porch, letting those sounds anchor me. The ordinary rhythm of ranch life felt like a balm, a reminder that the world went on even when death had nearly claimed me. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of crimson, Mary sat beside me on the porch steps. She clasped her hands in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "My father told me what Colton's done," she said softly. "You're carrying a burden that could destroy him, or destroy you if you're not careful." I nodded, my throat tight. I can't unhear his confession. "Colton murdered a man, and he meant to murder me too. If I stay silent, I may as well be burying myself again." Mary turned to me, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "Then you'll need more than courage. You'll need proof, and you'll need people willing to stand with you." Her words echoed her father's, and I felt their weight settle deeper inside me. She wasn't just offering comfort, she was offering resolve. "Why risk it?" I asked quietly. "You and your father could turn away, keep safe on this ranch." Her eyes flashed. "Because this land doesn't stay safe if men like Colton run free. And because you matter, Thomas, more than you seem to believe." I swallowed hard, unable to answer. The wind carried the smell of cattle and dust, the kind of scent that clung to every soul in Texas. For the first time since clawing my way out of that grave, I felt something stir in me, stronger than fear. It was purpose, bound tight with the trust of the Whitfields. The coffin hadn't broken me, it had remade me. And though my body was still healing, my spirit had already chosen its path. Night cloaked Dry Creek in silence, broken only by the rattle of shutters in the wind and the distant howl of coyotes on the plains. The Whitfield ranch slept, but I saddled my horse quietly, every movement careful. My body was still sore, my lungs still raw from the coffin, yet the fire in me left no room for rest. If Colton could bury a man alive, he could bury the truth as easily. The only way to fight him was to drag proof into the light. I rode into town under the cover of darkness, tying my horse behind the livery. The boardwalks creaked under my boots, though I stepped soft, keeping to the shadows. The sheriff's office stood at the center of town, its lamp burning dim. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding, then slipped around back where the window latch had never fit quite right. With careful pressure, it gave way. Inside, the office smelled of tobacco and gun oil, the air thick with it. Papers lay stacked on Colton's desk, some neat, others scattered. I rifled through them, fingers shaking, scanning for anything that tied him to the murder he confessed. Most were nothing: records of fines, cattle disputes, receipts for supplies. But at the bottom of a pile, half charred as though someone had tried to burn them, I found maps of land parcels marked in Colton's hand. The lines cut through neighboring ranches, including Whitfield's, with names scratched out and replaced with Colton's own. Fraud, land grabs. He'd been killing and framing men not out of rage, but out of greed. My breath caught, and in that instant, the door creaked. A boot scraped the floor. I froze, clutching the papers tight. "Well, well," a voice drawled behind me. "Like a rat in the corn crib." I turned to see Deputy Hank Rawley filling the doorway, his grin wide, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. The scar on his jaw caught the lamplight, making his face look even meaner than usual. "Evening, Hank," I said, forcing calm. "Didn't expect company." "Nor did I," he answered. "Sheriff said you were trouble, but I didn't think you'd be stupid enough to walk right into his den." My mind raced. If I fought him here, the noise would bring the whole town. If I ran, he'd gun me down before I hit the street. I eased the papers into my coat, praying he hadn't noticed. "Funny thing," I said, stalling. "You ever wonder why Colton's got so much land under his name?" "More than any sheriff has right to hold." His eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering. "Careful, Avery." "I heard him," I pressed, my voice low, steady. "I know he killed a man and buried him. And now I know why. Land. Power. How long before he decides you're just another witness he can't afford to keep breathing?" The grin slipped from Hank's face, replaced by a flicker of doubt. But only for a moment. He shook his head and spat into the corner. "You talk pretty, but words don't weigh much against a badge and a gun." He stepped closer, and my hand itched toward my Colt. The tension stretched thin as wire. Then, from outside, a drunk stumbled down the boardwalk singing off-key, kicking over a bucket with a clang. Hank's head turned instinctively, and in that breath of distraction I lunged past him, shoving hard into his shoulder. He cursed, stumbling, his revolver scraping free, but I was already through the back window, rolling into the dirt. I hit the ground hard, clutching the papers close, then scrambled to my horse. A gunshot split the night, splinters flying from the post above my head. Another followed, then another, but the darkness covered me and the horse carried me swift and sure out of town. My chest heaved, my body aching, but the documents were safe against my chest. Proof. Not enough to bring Colton down yet, but enough to show the shape of his lies. Enough to know I wasn't chasing shadows. As the wind whipped past me, one truth steadied my racing heart. I had stolen a piece of Colton's power from under his nose, and he would stop at nothing to take it back. The ride back to the Whitfield ranch was long, and every hoofbeat drummed the same thought into me. A single man could not bring down Sheriff Colton. Proof alone wouldn't hold against the weight of his power. I needed people, voices strong enough to stand together when fear told them to stay quiet. The papers I carried pressed against my chest, a fragile shield that meant little without those willing to see the truth. At sunrise, Jacob studied the half-burned documents spread across his table. His brow furrowed, his jaw tight as stone. "This is a start," he said, "but paper won't convince Dry Creek. Folks don't read ink, they read fear. And Colton's been writing fear into this town for years. So we need more than words," I said. "We need people who've felt his hand heavy on their neck," Jacob answered. That day I walked the town not as a ranch hand, but as a man searching for cracks in Colton's hold. My first stop was the church. Reverend Samuel Moore, a grey-haired man with a voice that once stirred hope, sat in the empty pews polishing the altar. His hands trembled as he worked, not from age, but from the burden of silence. "Reverend," I said quietly, sliding onto the bench beside him, "how long have you kept Colton's secrets buried under prayer?" He looked at me sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Careful, Thomas. Speaking against him out loud is like walking blindfolded through a nest of rattlers." "I was buried alive because of him," I replied, my voice rough. "I've seen his shadow closer than most. But you know the truth, don't you? How many confessions have you heard from widows whose husbands never came home? How many prayers have you whispered for justice that never came?" His face broke, pain spilling through the cracks of his restraint. "More than I can count," he admitted, "but I am one man, and my word would be swallowed whole if I stood alone." "You won't be alone," I promised. "When the time comes, your voice could turn the tide." From the church, I made my way to the blacksmith's forge. Henry Briggs hammered steel with arms thick as iron bars, sweat streaking his soot-darkened skin. When I asked about Colton, he slammed the hammer down harder than before, sparks flying. "Sheriff taxes me double what's fair," Henry growled. "Says it's for town upkeep. But I've seen no new boards on the walkways, no repairs on the roofs. Just more whiskey in his saloon and more cattle under his brand." "Would you stand against him?" I asked. Henry looked at me long, his chest heaving. "I've got 2 boys. Colton touches them, I'd break his skull in. But speaking out first, that's a gamble a father doesn't take lightly. I left him with no promise, only the seed of one. Last was Mrs. Eliza Turner, a widow who ran the laundry by the edge of town. Her husband had disappeared a year back, accused of stealing horses. Colton claimed he fled, shamed by his own crime. But when I told her I had reason to believe Colton silenced him, tears welled in her eyes. "I knew it," she whispered, clutching her apron. "They said I was mad, that grief blinded me. But I knew he never ran." Her grief hardened into resolve. "If you bring the truth, I'll stand. I've got nothing left for him to take from me." By nightfall, I returned to the ranch, weary but not broken. Mary waited on the porch, her gaze steady as ever. "You found them, didn't you?" she asked. "Not many," I admitted, "but enough to know Colton's mask is cracking. They're afraid, but the fear is turning. Slowly." She nodded, her eyes catching the last light of dusk. "Fear can bind people, Thomas, but it can also set them free, once they see they're not alone." Her words echoed in me as the crickets began their chorus. For the first time since crawling out of that grave, I felt the faint stirrings of strength not just in myself, but in the people of Dry Creek. Silent allies, waiting for the right moment to speak. Dry Creek Saloon was the beating heart of the town, where whiskey flowed thicker than water and poker hands decided more fates than bullets. That night, the place was alive with laughter, boots stomping against the wooden floor and the tinny clatter of the piano. But beneath the haze of smoke and spilled liquor, I felt the weight of every eye as I pushed through the swinging doors. Word traveled fast in towns like ours, and Colton had already sown plenty of it against me. Sheriff Colton sat at the far end of the room, one boot propped on a chair, his badge catching the lamplight. He wasn't drinking. He never drank much when he wanted control. His deputies filled the tables nearby, their presence thick with menace. He saw me the moment I entered, his lips curling into that cold smile that never reached his eyes. "Well, if it ain't Thomas Avery," he called, his voice carrying easily over the din. Back from the grave and still kicking. The room quieted, laughter fading into uneasy silence. All I could hear was the clink of a glass being set down and the shuffle of boots against the floor. I walked steady toward the bar, ignoring the burn of his gaze. "Evening, Sheriff," I said, my voice calm, though my insides twisted. Colton leaned back, his tone dripping with mockery. "I hear you've been whispering around town, stirring doubts." "That true?" "I've been talking truth," I replied, keeping my back straight. "There's a difference." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Folks didn't often hear someone stand toe-to-toe with Colton. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, though his smile stayed fixed. "Truth," he repeated, slow and deliberate, and... "Funny thing about truth, it can get a man killed quicker than a lie." Hank Rawley chuckled darkly from his table. "Reckon Avery's got a death wish." I turned to the crowd, my voice louder now, steady as I could make it. "Colton says he keeps this town safe, but tell me this. How many men have gone missing since he's worn that badge? How many widows left with no answers? How many ranches stripped from families under his watch?" The saloon went still. A few men glanced at one another, unease spreading like fire through dry grass. I saw doubt flicker in their eyes, faint but real. Colton rose slowly, the room parting around him. His hand hovered near his gun, though he didn't draw. "Careful, Avery," he warned. "You're digging holes you can't climb out of." I held his gaze. "I've already been in the ground once, Sheriff, didn't take." A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the crowd. Mary's words about fear turning to freedom echoed in my head. Every heartbeat told me I was close to pushing too far, yet stepping back now would mean surrender. Colton's smile slipped, replaced by a glare that could cut glass. "You think you can turn this town against me?" "I don't need to," I said quietly. "You've already done that yourself. They just haven't admitted it yet." The tension in the room thickened, every man waiting for the first move. Hank's hand twitched toward his revolver, but Colton raised his palm, stopping him. For all his anger, the sheriff knew better than to spill blood in front of witnesses tonight. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "You keep on this path, Avery, and I'll bury you deeper than before. And next time, no Whitfield will be there to dig you out." I didn't flinch, though his words chilled me. "Then you best hope the dirt hides your sins, Sheriff. Because I'll keep digging until they're all laid bare." The piano started again, hesitant at first, then louder, trying to wash away the storm brewing in that saloon. But the faces told the truth. Cracks had formed in Colton's hold. Small, fragile, but cracks all the same. I stepped back, my heart pounding, knowing I'd walked out alive tonight only because Colton had chosen it so. The next time I might not be so lucky. The morning after the saloon, whispers traveled through Dry Creek like wildfire. Some folks avoided my eyes on the street, pretending I wasn't there. Others looked at me with a spark of something new, curiosity, maybe even hope. Colton had kept this town under his thumb for years, but last night I had cracked the surface. Still, I knew cracks alone weren't enough. They had to widen before they became collapse. Back at the Whitfield ranch, Jacob warned me that Colton wouldn't let the confrontation slide. "Men like him don't forget a public slight," he said, his tone grim. "He'll come at you harder now, count on it." I nodded, though the truth was already weighing on me. Every step forward brought sharper danger, and it wasn't only mine to bear. The Whitfields had thrown in their lot with me, and Colton knew it. Later that day, a knock came at the ranch door. When I opened it, I found Henry Briggs, the blacksmith, standing there with his cap in his hands, his shoulders hunched as though he carried more than just his own weight. "Thomas," he said, his voice low. "Can we talk?" We sat at the table, Mary pouring him coffee while Jacob studied him from across the room. Henry's eyes darted nervously, as if even inside the ranch walls, Colton's gaze might pierce through. "I heard what you said last night," Henry muttered. "About the sheriff, about the men who vanished. You're not wrong, I've thought the same for years." "Then stand with us," I said quickly. "Your voice could tip others. Folks respect you." Henry's hands trembled around the mug. He shook his head. "It ain't that simple. Colton came to me this morning. He said if I didn't tell him what you were planning, he'd see to it my boys were taken from me. Said the law could find them guilty of theft, whether they'd stolen or not. I can't risk that." Jacob's jaw tightened. "So you came here to sell him information?" Henry flinched at the words, shame darkening his face. "I don't want to. Lord knows I don't. But I can't let my family be destroyed. I came to warn you that he's pressing me. If he doesn't get what he wants, he'll make my life hell." The silence in the room stretched long. Betrayal wasn't always born from malice. Sometimes it was carved from fear. I saw the conflict in Henry's eyes, the way love for his children warred with the danger of defying Colton. "Henry," I said slowly, "if you give him what he wants, you hand him the rope he'll use to hang us all. And he won't stop at you and your boys. He'll keep pushing until every decent man in Dry Creek is buried. You know that." He bowed his head, unable to meet my gaze. "I know," he whispered. "God help me, I know, but I ain't strong enough to stand against him." He rose, muttering thanks for the coffee, and left as quickly as he came. The door shut behind him, leaving the weight of his fear lingering in the room. Mary spoke first, her voice steady. "He's not the enemy, he's just trapped. Colton's the one holding the chains." But chains in a man's hands could still cut deep. That night, as I walked the ranch fences, I kept looking toward town, half expecting riders to come thundering out of the dark. Henry's warning had planted more than doubt. It planted certainty that Colton now knew I was moving against him. When the attack came, it wasn't with guns, but with silence. A friend lost to fear, a voice turned inward instead of outward. Betrayal didn't always shout. "Sometimes," it whispered, and though I couldn't prove it yet, I felt the truth heavy in my bones. Colton had found a crack in our resolve, and he was ready to drive it wide open. The wind shifted that night. It wasn't just the scent of rain on the horizon, or the low growl of thunder rolling in. It was something deeper, something wrong in the bones. Jacob felt it too. He stood out near the barn, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the pasture, where the darkness seemed thicker than usual. "They're coming," he said simply. I tightened the strap on my revolver, heart already racing. "How many?" "Enough." Mary moved through the house like a whisper, loading rifles, checking bolts on the windows. She didn't ask if we were sure. She knew. The silence Henry had left behind had become a siren in our ears. The first torch came just after midnight, arcing through the air like a comet and landing against the side of the hay barn. Flames caught fast in the dry straw, lighting the night in a hellish glow. Then came the riders, 5, maybe 6 faces masked with bandanas, rifles drawn. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. This wasn't a robbery, it was a warning. Jacob fired first, his rifle cracking like thunder. One of the riders fell, tumbling hard from the saddle, but the rest pressed forward, shots exploding across the yard. I dove behind a trough, firing back as bullets split the fence rails. Mary took position at the upstairs window, her shots calm and precise. She dropped a second rider before he reached the porch. The cattle spooked, bawling and trampling fences as they scattered into the night. The smell of burning wood and gunpowder thickened the air. Smoke stung my eyes, but I kept firing. One bullet at a time, steady and deliberate. Jacob shouted from the corner of the barn, reloading fast. "They're not looking to kill, they're looking to scare us off." "They're doing a hell of a job," I muttered, ducking another shot that shattered a lantern near the stables. Suddenly, hoofbeats pounded from behind the ridge. At first, I thought more of Colton's men had arrived, but instead I saw 2 of the ranch hands, Luis and Joe, charging down from the far fence line, rifles raised. Their arrival sent the attackers scattering, vanishing into the trees as quickly as they had come. The gunfire stopped. The barn blazed hot and high, casting flickering light over the damage. Fence rails torn apart. One steer dead, shot in the chaos. Another limped across the pasture, bleeding. Jacob stepped forward, his rifle still warm. "Cowards," he muttered, watching the flames consume months of labor. Mary came outside, her face pale but resolute. "They'll be back," she said. I nodded, adrenaline still surging in my veins. That wasn't a raid. That was a message. "Colton wants us rattled," Jacob said. "Wants us to break, to doubt. But this," he gestured to the flames. "This only hardens my spine." We doused what was left of the fire by dawn. The barn smoldered, nothing but blackened beams and ash. The cattle were rounded up, some wounded, others gone. The ranch had taken a blow, but it still stood. Later that morning, as we patched fences and counted heads, I found Mary alone near the edge of the pasture. She stared into the trees where the riders had vanished, her arms crossed tight. "I used to think justice was something quiet," she said, "something handled in courts and sermons, but it's not, is it?" "No," I said softly. "Not out here. Out here, justice has to be louder than fear." She turned to me, her eyes sharp. "Then we make it loud, Thomas. Loud enough that even Colton can't pretend not to hear." I took her hand in mine, not as comfort but as promise. We'd survived the night, and they had failed to break us. The fire had burned our barn, but not our resolve. By the time the barn's ashes cooled, the name Elias Turner had surfaced more than once. A former deputy, long vanished, whispered about in hushed tones by those who remembered when Colton first rose to power. Some said Elias knew too much, others said he'd fled with guilt thick on his back. But Jacob remembered him different, honest, loyal, and scared out of town after Colton's first suspicious killing. "If Elias is alive," Jacob told me, "he's the key to breaking Colton wide open. He saw things, heard things, things that never made it into any report. Finding him wouldn't be easy. He was last seen near the Devil's Backbone, a jagged stretch of canyons and scrubland a day's ride out. It was no man's land. Rattlers, flash floods, and outlaws used it for hiding. I packed light and rode hard, leaving before sunrise, the wind cold against my skin, the sky streaked in grey. The trail was rough, winding through dry riverbeds and brittle mesquite thickets. Twice I had to dismount and lead my horse across narrow ledges carved by time. By dusk, I spotted smoke curling from a rocky hollow. I tied the horse to a pinon tree and approached slow, my hand near my colt. A man crouched by a campfire, skin leathery from sun, beard streaked with grey. He heard me before I spoke, rising with a rifle already aimed. "I ain't looking for trouble," I said. "Name's Thomas Avery. I came about Sheriff Colton." The name hung in the air like poison. Elias Turner didn't lower his rifle. "You work for him?" he asked, eyes narrowed. "No, I nearly died because of him. Buried alive." He paused. His hands trembled slightly. "I knew he'd do it someday. Always knew that man had murder in him. I just didn't expect he'd bury someone twice." I stepped closer, slow. "I've got people standing with me, townsfolk. But we need more than proof on paper. We need a voice from the past, a voice with weight." Elias stared at the fire, silent for a long moment. "You don't know what you're asking. I saw what he did. The first man he killed, James Redley. Colton said it was self-defense, said Redley pulled first. But it was a lie. I was there. I saw Colton draw while Redley still had his hands in the air." My heart thudded. "Will you testify to that?" He looked at me, pain etched in every line of his face. "I ain't stepped foot in Dry Creek in 6 years. I left because I knew staying would mean my grave." He's got eyes everywhere. "You're not alone this time," I said. "I've got documents, I've got voices starting to speak, and I've got the Whitfields. Colton's scared, Elias. That's why he's lashing out. You show your face, you won't be alone. You'll be the spark that lights the whole fire." Elias sat slowly, staring into the flames. "I've spent 6 years looking over my shoulder, hiding. But if I die out here with what I know, Colton wins. Maybe it's time I stopped running." I nodded. "Then come with me. We'll ride at first light. You'll be safe, I swear it." He chuckled, dry as dust. "No one's safe in Dry Creek. But I believe you'll try." I stayed the night by his fire. The wind howled over the ridge, coyotes crying in the dark. But something else stirred beneath it. A shift. A current pulling toward reckoning. In the morning, Elias mounted his old gelding and rode beside me. He didn't speak much, but his silence wasn't fear anymore. It was purpose. We rode east toward the rising sun, and behind us, the canyon slowly swallowed his years of hiding. Ahead lay a town still shackled by one man's cruelty, but the key to its freedom rode beside me. We rode into Dry Creek under a slate-gray sky, the kind that seemed to press the world down a little heavier. Elias Turner kept his hat low, collar up, but even under the shadow of his brim, I saw the tightness in his jaw, the way his eyes darted toward alleys and rooftops. The past doesn't let go easy, not in a place like this. Jacob met us just outside town. his rifle resting casually against the saddle horn. He studied Elias in silence for a moment before offering a nod. "Didn't think I'd see your face again." "I didn't think I'd survive long enough for it," Elias replied. Back at the ranch, we laid everything out, the documents I'd stolen, the land maps with forged names, and now Elias's first-hand testimony. Jacob listened closely while Mary took notes, her handwriting sharp and steady. Every detail mattered now. "We're close," I said. "We've got enough to turn the town. But it has to be done right." Jacob leaned back in his chair. "If we make one wrong move, Colton will strike harder than ever. We need to hit him where he can't shoot back. Truth public and loud." The plan formed faster than I expected. Reverend Moore agreed to speak from the pulpit, an open forum, not just a sermon. He'd gather the townsfolk under the guise of a community meeting. There, Elias would tell his truth. The papers would be handed out. We'd expose Colton not with gunfire, but with the weight of evidence and witness. Mary took to the town quietly, visiting the women first: Eliza Turner, the widow, Mrs. Duncan from the general store, young Clara Briggs, whose brothers had been threatened. She spoke not as a rebel, but as one of them, calm and convincing. "They're listening," she told me that night. "The fear's still there, but it's cracking. People want Colton gone, they just need to believe it's possible." And it was starting to be. Henry Briggs showed up at the ranch 2 nights before the meeting, hat in hand again, but this time his eyes held fire instead of shame. "I told Colton I'd keep quiet," he said, "but I lied. My boys deserve a town worth growing up in." I clasped his hand. "We'll stand together then, all of us." Even Luis and Joe, the ranch hands, brought friends from other outfits, men who had lost wages, land, respect. The blacksmith, the preacher, ranchers, shopkeepers, quiet allies no longer silent. Still, the threat loomed. Hank Rawley had been seen riding the edge of town, watching. The sheriff hadn't shown himself since the saloon. That meant he was planning something. "Think he knows?" Elias asked as we prepared our notes. "He knows," I said, "but this time we won't be the ones caught off guard." The night before the meeting, the wind howled like it remembered every wrong Dry Creek had suffered. I stood outside the bunkhouse, watching the stars flicker behind shifting clouds. Mary joined me, her arms wrapped tight against the chill. "You're sure about this?" she asked. "As sure as I was when I heard him confess," I said. "Only difference now, I'm not alone." She nodded, her hand finding mine. "Tomorrow changes everything." "It does," I said, gripping her fingers like a lifeline, one way or another. Morning would come soon, and with it, our reckoning. We weren't riding in with guns drawn, but with truth. And that truth had gathered its own kind of power. Colton ruled through fear. But we had something deeper now, conviction, shared by those who had seen too much and lost too many. The net was closing, and the sheriff for the first time would have no place to hide. The morning came heavy with the promise of change. It wasn't just the storm-clouded sky or the low rumble of thunder that echoed through the valley. It was the weight of everything. Truth, consequence, justice, hanging in the air like the stillness before a gunfight. The townsfolk gathered in the church, unsure whether they were walking into a reckoning or a riot. The pews were filled with faces hardened by years of fear, but there was something new in their eyes, a flicker of hope. Reverend Moore's voice rang clear, steady, as he called the meeting to order, but it wasn't just a sermon today. This time, he was speaking to a town on the edge of its reckoning, and I was ready to let them hear the truth. Elias stood at the pulpit, his hands gripping the edge as if the weight of the past might send him crashing to his knees. The room fell silent, every eye on him. "I've been hiding from the truth for too long," Elias began, his voice rough but unyielding. 6 years. I've run, and I'm tired of it. The man who stood up here and claimed to protect this town is the same man who buried men alive, who stole land, and who murdered anyone who got in his way. The words hit the room like a fist. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some faces going pale, others twisting in disbelief. But as Elias spoke, I could see it, the slow change in the air, the shift from fear to something sharper, something angrier. Colton's men had slipped into the back of the church, trying to blend into the shadows. Hank Rawley, ever the enforcer, stood tall near the door, his hand resting casually on his gun, but his eyes flicked nervously to the crowd. Colton had to know the net was closing. I stepped forward, pulling the stack of documents from my coat and setting them on the pulpit. The papers were more than just evidence. They were the foundation of Colton's downfall. Maps, forged names, receipts, all with Colton's fingerprints across them. "This is proof," I said, my voice loud enough to carry to the farthest corners of the room. "Proof of the fraud, the lies, and the blood he spilled. We've all seen the things Colton does, but now we have the evidence to back it up, and it's time we stop hiding behind the walls of silence." I turned to face the back of the room, where Colton's men shifted uncomfortably. "It's time to bring him into the light. It's time we stop letting him decide who lives and who dies." A murmur of agreement began to rise from the crowd. Slowly at first, then louder, a voice called from the back. "You tell him, Avery!" Colton's deputies moved then, pulling their guns from beneath their coats. The tension in the room snapped tight as a rope, and for a moment I thought everything would descend into chaos. But just as Hank Rawley raised his hand to draw, a voice rang out. "Enough!" It was Sheriff Colton. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of rage, his eyes cold and calculating. The doors swung open behind him, and the townsfolk parted like a wave before him. "You think you can turn this town against me?" Colton sneered, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. "You think you can take me down with a few lies and a bunch of rustlers' papers?" "We don't need to lie, Sheriff," I said, my voice unwavering. "We have the truth, and we've got enough of us to make sure it's heard." Colton's eyes flicked from me to Elias, then back to the crowd. The air crackled with the unspoken threat, but I stood my ground. "You've got no power here anymore, Colton," I continued. "Your men are already losing their nerve. The people you've been hurting, they're standing up, and they're not afraid anymore. It's over." For a moment it seemed like Colton was going to draw, to end it all in a blaze of gunfire. But then something shifted in his eyes, something that told me he saw the truth and that he knew his time was up. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice venomous. "You've got nothing. I'll burn this town to the ground before I let you take it from me." But even as he spoke, the door behind him creaked open again. This time it was the town's lawmen who stepped through, the men who had been in Colton's pocket, now stepping away from his shadow. They weren't afraid anymore. The truth had stripped the fear away. "You're done, Colton," one of them said, his voice steady. "We've seen the proof. We know what you've done." Colton's face twisted in fury as he realized the net had finally closed around him. There was nowhere left to run. The sheriff didn't resist as they moved in to arrest him. The man who had ruled Dry Creek for so long now stood powerless, his grip on the town finally shattered. And for the first time in years, Dry Creek took a breath. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of Colton's tyranny. It was the beginning of something new. The dust settled slow in Dry Creek after Colton was led away. The sun broke through the clouds that afternoon, casting golden light across the town like it was exhaling for the first time in years. Folks didn't cheer. They didn't dance in the street. It wasn't that kind of victory. It was quieter, heavier, the kind that comes after survival, not celebration. I stood outside the church with Elias and Jacob, watching as the people dispersed. Some faces were still pale, others red with the rush of everything that had just happened, but most walked with their heads higher than before. "You did it," Elias said quietly, his voice hoarse. "No," I said, shaking my head. "We did it. All of us. Together." Jacob let out a breath, slow and deep. Colton thought power came from fear. But fear don't hold up when truth stands tall enough. Down by the jailhouse, Colton sat behind bars, his badge stripped from his chest, his face hollow. He didn't speak as they passed by. He just stared. Maybe at me, maybe at the walls, maybe at everything he'd lost. Mary came to stand beside me, her eyes on the jail too. "There'll be a trial," she said. "A judge from Abilene's coming next week." "He'll be found guilty," I replied. "Elias's testimony, the papers, the townsfolk, it's too much to bury." She nodded, her hand finding mine again. "And after?" I looked out toward the edge of town, where the hills rolled into endless plains. The wind was soft that day, the scent of dry grass and warm earth rising with it. "I think I'll stay a while," I said. "Help rebuild what Colton tore down. The barn, the fences, maybe more than that." Mary smiled, faint but sure. "This place still needs people who believe in doing what's right." Elias planned to leave after the trial. He'd seen justice begin its course, and the ghosts he carried had grown quiet. But he promised to return if needed. His name, once buried under fear, now stood among those who helped change the town. Henry Briggs brought his boys by the ranch later that week, offering lumber to help rebuild the barn. Others followed, men and women who'd once looked away now stepping forward. Piece by piece, the Whitfield Ranch came back to life. One morning I sat on the porch as the sun rose, Jacob beside me with coffee in hand. We didn't speak for a long time, just watched the cattle moving slow across the fields. He finally broke the silence. "You came here just a cowhand. Quiet. Kept to yourself." I chuckled. "Didn't plan on digging up corruption and nearly dying in the process." Jacob looked at me, his eyes thoughtful. "You've got grit and sense. This ranch could use a man like that long term." "I've been thinking the same," I said. Mary appeared at the doorway then, apron tied, eyes warm. "Good," she said, "because we already built you a new bunkhouse." I laughed, the sound raw and real. After everything, being buried alive, hunted, betrayed, shot at, laughter came easier than I expected. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows from the barn frame we'd started rebuilding. I watched the light move across the land and felt something stir in my chest, a sense of place, of peace. Dry Creek wasn't perfect. It still bore scars, still had wounds to mend. But it had found its voice. The people had found their strength. And me? I'd found something more than vengeance. I'd found purpose. So if you've ridden with me this far, if you've walked through the dust and darkness and come out the other side, then I ask you, don't let go now. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, for more truths that need telling. And if you're not ready to ride off just yet, click on the next video on your screen. The journey's not over. There's more out there. Always is. The West doesn't sleep, and neither should we.